back to part two of Mayan Empire. So, in the last lecture, we saw a broad overview. Now we're going to get into a little more detail about the political organization, to the degree that we know, we thought we don't know, and the religion of the Maya. So, by the height of the Classic period, there were as many as 80 Mayan city-states. I don't know if you can see them in there, right? So this little red outline is the extent of the Mayan Empire. Part of it is in modern Mexico, part in Guatemala, Belize over there to the east, and then a little bit of Honduras in the south. So we've seen city-states before when we discussed the Greek. The Greek city-states were what we call a segmentary model. Each state functioned as a politically independent unit. Some were more powerful than others, but voted for its own. It was a democracy like Athens, right? If you were a citizen of Athens, you weren't on anything that was going on in Sparta, and vice versa. Uh, whether this is the case in the Mayan city-states or whether there was more central authority, right? So that one dominant, certainly some city-states were dominant during different periods. Did that mean what degree of control then over other city-states is not clear. We have stelae, right? And these list some battles, some marriages, some genealogical information, but it just doesn't give us a complete enough portrait of the political organization of the Mayan Empire. So, in this classic period, the concept of kingship arises. There were kings. They were considered divine leaders, like China and many other empires. Right, political and religious authority were completely merged, and this was emphasized by regular ceremonies that linked the king with mythology of the divine origins of the Maya, which we'll get into a little bit later in this lecture. Um, and during this sort of classic period is when the stelae appear, which recount the exploits of these kings. Um, and it's not clear whether these kings were sort of absolute rulers of all this other city-states or many other city-states. It's possible that the Mayan conception of kingship was, in fact, and of territory was. We'll get into that a little bit more shortly. Each king had a name and a successor number, which would be a very useful thing for archaeologists, right? Because it tells you exactly where in the line from the first king they are. Unfortunately, they often did not write the successor number down in the stelae, just the name, and so incredibly convenient system is not as helpful as it could be because we don't always have the successor numbers. These dynasties tended to be patrilineal, right? So it was um, largely a patriarchy, but as in other cultures, like England, for example, right? If there wasn't a son or if there was an appropriate male candidate to be king, then queens would rule at times. There's one who's mentioned in Stele named Lady Six Sky, and we know about her. She was queen because her son, Bird Jaguar, uh, made sure to mention her and keep her remembered on this stele. So the life of a Mayan was marked by uh, religious ceremonies at certain milestones. So at age 5 or 6, there would be a ritual bloodletting that would occur, and then if you were a aristocrat and you were a young adult, you were expected to go to war and take captives, and then when you did, the names of these captives would be recorded on stelae to sort of mark your ascension into manhood. Um, if you were king, uh, there was a whole ceremony right around your ascension to the throne that included sitting on a jaguar pelt, wearing a special scarf around your head, jester god. We'll see more on this when we get to the hero twins. Headdress of jade, shells, feathers. Uh, Lots of ceremonies, lots of them involving blood. Classic period also is largest temples and palaces. So these palaces were, where the king lived and his King's Court, the administrative bureaucracy of the Mayan Empire, and we have paintings that preserve some of the everyday in these palaces. So we have uh, pictured kings sitting on a throne surrounded by numerous wives. We'll see court jesters, feasts, dancing, um, slaves being presented to the king, and lines of people paying tribute to the king. Um, we're not entirely sure, who are these people paying tribute? Are they regular citizens? Are they asking for some sort of favor? Are they people who have been conquered? Again, it's hard to say. So settlements appear to have been organized in a four-tiered hierarchy. So you'd have a large city-state, right, like Tikal or something, and it would be surrounded by smaller villages and hamlets. Um, and, and with the largest city-states, there were basically four levels of surrounding communities, right? Um, all at the bottom, and then sort of two tiers in between. The development from right the smaller societies to the larger ones was certainly facilitated by trade, um, and we mentioned this earlier that in the development of the Mayan civilization, the stages to the classic period, uh, we see the use of stele propagating from the north down. So it's likely that civilization spread from the north down, and some smaller villages gradually developed into large city states. So there was civilization before the Maya in America. Teotihuacan, which is sort of near about 20 miles from Mexico City, was around from 600 to 1 AD to 600 AD. There's some disagreement over how much interaction the Maya had with Teotihuacan and how influenced they were. It's almost certain that they some interaction and some influence, but they did overlap considerably. Um, it seems clear that the Mayans, right? We have artifacts from Teotihuacan in Mayan sites. There was definitely uh, some interaction. Was it peaceful trading? Was it conquest? It's hard to say. The Mayans copied certain pottery and architectural styles of Teotihuacan. You can see this here. We have this large temple, and there's some similarity, right? The Mayan ones tend to be a little bit steeper, right? But clearly there's some influence, right? And this interaction almost certainly gave Mayan civilization a little leg up, right? Create everything, all their ideas from scratch. One sort of interesting technique that we have these days is we can analyze bone fragments, determine the source of that person's drinking water, right? And we can figure out where they lived. And it turns out that some of the remains of people in Maya locations originate from the area around Teotihuacan. So there's almost certainly a good deal of interaction. So there's certainly a good deal of war among the city-state, and you'll recall this is cited as one of the possible reasons for the decline of Mayan civilization, the extent of this war. Tikal, which is in Guatemala and was at various times the preeminent city-state of the Maya, um, was defeated by another city-state. We're not sure whether it was the Caracol or the Calakmul. I may be mispronouncing the latter one. I've been to Caracol um, in 500 AD or so, right? So then Calakmul was the dominant city-state for a while, conquered some other city-states. Then Tikal came back, again became the dominant, more or less constant states of war among the city-states. We have, the later it gets, the more detailed records we have on the stele, and we can see some fairly detailed accounts of the various alliances, uh, city-states, colorful names, right? Lady Six Guy, we mentioned Smoking Squirrel, of, of an important figure. So this discovery that there was extensive warfare is actually sort of a new thing, uh, relatively recent, given that we can now translate hieroglyphs on the stele. Earlier scholarship had portrayed the Maya as entirely peaceful people, but not the case. Um, we also now have murals that depict the warfare. We have evidence of walls, sometimes of stone, sometimes of earth. These are hard to date, right? But it's likely that they were Mayan as well. Uh, and so a lot of this is speculative, but one can imagine that warfare sort of developed in the same way it does all over the world, which is, you have small villages and little raiding parties, right, to a long-standing feud in which one village will attack another village and maybe take some captives or steal, and the the insult is returned, right, over time. And as these uh, small village armies sort of coalesce and create alliances, as the city-states grow, you get larger and larger battles over larger territory. As we'll see, the notion of territory is a complicated one for the Maya. Human sacrifice was certainly practiced, and it was often the losers in a battle that were sacrificed. It's not really clear, like when you watch the film Apocalypto, we'll see a sort of a raid where people are captured. Um, and the point is not to sort of capture territory there, but simply to bring back prisoners. Now, we'll also see some dispute about this film. Just a spoiler alert, or not a spoiler alert, I guess trigger warning now, Apocalypto, incredibly violent film. And some Mayan peoples and some scholars have been kind of offended by that portrayal of the Mayans. Certainly there was violence in the society, there was human sacrifice, but there's a whole heck of a lot of it in Apocalypto. Maybe not quite a balanced view of what was really going on. Um, but at any rate, the point was we certainly know that captives were taken, captives were sacrificed. It's not at all clear that territory was being acquired in any goal in sort of capturing a city and making it your own and using their infrastructure, things like that. Appear, as far as we can tell, to have been the point of warfare. So wars were typically organized and led by a king who led large armies, typically well trained. Uh, Again, it seemed like the aim was often to capture enemy soldiers, preferably an aristocrat, someone of high rank, that they would then be sacrificed, and this would be a humiliation to the enemy. Um, Sometimes the aim was conquest, uh, but as by conquest, largely they meant kind of more or less what the Mongols did, which is just burn the city to the ground, right? Not try to take it over or subjugate its population, but simply destroy it. And defensive structures, walls and pits were constructed to prevent it happening to you. Um, in later periods, often cities were built on hilltops because they're much more easily defensible. And in this period, warfare was much more. Um, Surprisingly little attention has been paid to Mayan weaponry, but they did have weapons. Obsidian, again, was uh, used all over the empire. It's incredibly sharp. Um, some of the Mayan type weapons here was used as spear points, various sorts of darts, knives, right? There was no metal. So they were all made of stone, wood, and so the stelae do not record any territorial boundaries. So we get accounts of cities being sacked or conquered, but we don't know if that meant that that city was acquired, right, into a larger empire, or if the Maya even conceptualized politics in that way. No concept of acquiring territory. Um, some scholars have argued that, yeah, the expansion of territory was not the point. How we think about it, um, how we think about it, but it's not how the Mayans thought about it. And instead, it was sort of something like the expansion of political influence, reputation, uh, things like that. And this, if that's the correct interpretation, it makes sense of the fact that often the goal of the warfare seemed to be the taking of high-ranking enemies rather than territory, right? The emphasis on taking prisoners. Um, so we don't really know, again, how they conceptualize territory. We don't know if there's a strict hierarchy between, right, powerful city-states and smaller towns nearby, whether they dictated, um, right, the politics of smaller surrounding villages. But something like that must have been the case, right? Given the size of the larger cities, uh, the smaller villages and the farms would have had to have been supplying that city with food, and in order to support, bureaucracy and kings and queens, right? Food had to have been supplied to people that were working for it. There had to have been some sort of hierarchy, some degree of domination between the larger city-states and the smaller villages. All right, so on to religion. Uh, we know a good deal about Mayan religion, from the many artifacts that remain, and a lot of those because religion was so deeply woven into life and even political life. Nearly everything we know about Maya reveals something about the religion. So the stelae, which record the events in the life of the king, also record the religious ceremonies that accompanied each event. Right? Each significant event had some sort of religious ritual along with it. Bloodletting was a common component of these religious ceremonies. Uh, Obsidian blades would be used to cut the body in some area, and collect the blood, and you could then burn it as an offering to the gods. There was also cords would be pulled through in the ear, the tongue, the penis, and we've seen these portrayed in pottery art. Heart, which is a if you've ever seen sort of one of the Indiana Jones movies, they do this. They do this in the Apocalypto movies as well. It's not clear if this was as common as it's portrayed in films because it's a spectacular sort of scene, but at any rate, it was probably practiced occasionally. So we have a religious text of the Maya, which is the Popol Vuh, written much later in like the 16th century in Guatemala. So it was not written at the time of the peak of Mayan civilization, uh, but it does nonetheless preserve a Mayan religion, and we see the themes and the characters reflected in actual, um, pottery and art from the classic period. So it's roughly accurate of what the Mayan religion would have been at the time. We have other Mayan texts that preserve some of their work in astronomy and mathematics as well. And so the religious texts, so again, there's the Popol Vuh and then there's other texts, right? So, and they don't always agree. So we have some texts that describe an early race of people destroyed by some great flood. And then we have the Mayan world, right? The Mayan world is created with four corners, each held up by a pillar, and in the center, supported by the world tree. And we have the gods and the ancestors residing in the underworld. The picture painted by the Popol Vuh is similar in many ways, but also different. And we're going to move to that now because we have much more of that preserved. So, according to the creation story of the Popol Vuh, the serpent god of the sea meets with the sky god, and they talk about how to create a world, you know, animals, humans, and so on. They try a few times using different materials, which all fail. Um, then they talk to the old gods. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce those names. If you're curious, the X's are pronounced as or she, um, like an SH, right? Um, but the old gods know something about astronomy. They help them out. Still, they have another failed attempt at creating beings out of wood, but that does succeed in creating monkeys. And then finally, they find the proper material, which is corn, and they use corn to create humans. Um, then the Popol Vuh sort of interrupts this creation story to tell a long story about the hero twins. And these twins predate humanity, and in their adventures, they make the creation of humanity possible. And the adventures of the hero twins sort of form the core of the mythology of the Mayans. So the twins begin by killing a monster, Seven Macaw, and they take his various body parts, and those body parts create the heavenly bodies, the stars, and the planets, and so on. The flood that was mentioned in previous slide is in at least one version of the Popol Vuh caused by the killing of Seven Macaw by the hero twins. And there's numerous adventures that establish various parts of the natural world, constellations, and things like that. Then they visit the underworld. They play on the ball court there, and there they're tricked and dismembered by, and so the hero twins often die and then regenerate, right? So their body parts, the existence of various types of vegetation. Um, anyway, the twins, they have all these ventures, often killed, often reborn, and each adventure explains some part of the natural world. And then at the end of all their adventures, twins become the sun and the moon. So as I mentioned, right, the Popol Vuh was written much later, but the archaeological evidence we have supports it as a roughly correct account of the Mayan religion. So we do have a stele from the pre-classic period, which features hero twins and Seven Macaw. Um, we even have sort of details that are mentioned in the Popol Vuh, like one of the twins in one of the battles loses his arm for a moment, and we have representations of that. And then in the classic period, tons of representations of the hero twins, typically depicted wearing these, the headbands that also the kings would wear, and they would often have black spots marking their faces, so you can recognize them in the pottery and such. So, how are humans created? So they're created from corn, right? And four men are created, and each of these four represents sort of four lineages of the ancestors, and these original men give blood offerings to the gods by purifying their bodies, establishing this as a religious ritual. And then the descendants of these four form the first Mayan settlements and establish some of the The Mayan universe, as portrayed in these texts, is divided into three parts. You've got sky, where the gods live, earth, where the humans live, and in the underworld, where other gods live, and also ancestors. And there were access points to the underworld. So temples um, were conceived and access to the underworld, right? Also, the sea, a portal to the underworld, right? And marine objects, religious significance. So the ball game, right, that the Maya played had a religious significance. The hero twins play the ball game in the Popol Vuh. Um, it evolved a rubber ball, right? So they take rubber from trees, made a ball, and you would hit the ball with your hip or your upper arm or your thigh, but you weren't allowed to use your hands or feet. And to score, you had to knock the ball through this hoop that was up on a wall. Seems like a um, it's probably some sort of precursor of soccer, right? Remember the Spanish conquistadors, they would have witnessed the Aztecs playing a later version of this game and may have, it's possible this is where the idea of soccer came from. Again, the game is mentioned in the Popol Vuh, uh, and the game has deep religious connotations. In practice, what would often happen is, again, we would have this warfare, enemies would be captured, and they would be required to play this game, and then if they lost, they would be tortured and killed. Um, so the ball courts also represented a kind of connection with the underworld as well, given that the court meant death and the underworld. So rituals were important for many aspects of everyday life for the Mayans. On a large scale, again, the Mayans were expert astronomers, And part of their view of the cosmos was that we need to do things here on Earth to keep the whole thing moving. And so uh, regular rituals were required to do that, to keep the universe in order and going about its way. Also, rituals would be used to obtain advice from the gods. So, if you had a certain important question and you needed to know what the gods thought or attempt to influence the gods, uh, you might engage in bloodletting, right? And later burning that blood as an offering. Uh, you might engage in fasting, and then also hallucination, using hallucinogenic plants, often by enema, was also used as a vision quest that was meant to give you answers about the right way to act. Um, Certainly, these rituals were practiced by common people, but the stele we have only describe the royal rituals. So, what we know about those is that a king would ascend to the top of the temple into the small room up there, and they would engage in one of the rituals, bloodletting or vision quest in that small room. But meanwhile, around the base of the temple, the population would all be gathered around as well, um, also doing bloodletting and with the blades and the stingray spines, all in an attempt to help, right, encourage the gods to give whatever advice was needed to the king. So that's a general look. Again, I wish, we had more time to spend on any particular civilization, but that's a broad overview of the political organization such as we know it, and religious life and mythology of the Hawaiian people. Um, Next, we'll be talking about the interaction of Europeans with the native peoples that they encountered much later than the Maya. And this is something that's portrayed wrongly in Apocalypto, the film we'll then watch, where at the end of Apocalypto, sorry to give away a spoiler, but they do cite, right, some European ships approaching. Of course, the Europeans, um, hundreds of years after the Mayan civilization had declined, there were still people of Mayan blood around, but there weren't any large cities in operation. And then we'll read some of the controversy around the Apocalypto film, which is very violent and many people argue portrays the Mayans in a relatively negative light, or at least a much more violent light than is probably accurate. So we'll get to that. It's at the very least an exciting movie, right? If it's a little too violent for you, that's all right. Just let me know, and I don't know, we can arrange some other assignment. But we'll get to that when we get to that, and I will see you next time.